How could one careless joke about my husband's little bells lead to a courtroom showdown and the end of my family? What happens when a joke meant to embarrass turns into a legal avalanche I never saw coming? Before we dive deeper into this story, I have one small request. Please subscribe, drop a like, comment, and hit that hype button to boost this channel so more people can discover these incredible stories. The restaurant buzzed with birthday cheer as our family gathered around the corner table at Romano's. Nolan sat quietly at the head, his 36th birthday cake flickering with candles while everyone sang. I watched him force a smile, the same polite expression he'd worn for months, whenever we were in public together. "Make a wish, honey," I said, leaning closer with my phone ready to capture the moment. But honestly, I was already thinking about how boring this whole evening felt. Same restaurant, same people, same predictable Nolan being, well, predictable. After he blew out the candles, his mother Irene started her usual fussing. "Oh, Nolan, remember when you were 6 and insisted on chocolate cake with vanilla frosting? You were so particular about everything, even then." "Still is," I laughed, perhaps a bit too loudly. "You should see him organize his sock drawer. Everything has to be perfectly lined up, color-coordinated. I keep telling him to loosen up, but you know how he is." Nolan's brother Bryce chuckled. "Some things never change, right?" That's when the idea hit me. The perfect opportunity to get everyone laughing, to be the center of attention for once instead of listening to another boring story about Nolan's childhood quirks. "Speaking of things that are small and organized," I said, grinning as I looked around the table, "you should see how Nolan arranges his Christmas decorations, those little jingle bells he hangs on the tree. He measures the distance between each one with a ruler. I told him last year, 'Honey, your little bells are too small to even argue with me about where they should go.'" The table erupted in laughter. My mother Sylvia nearly choked on her wine, slapping the table. "Oh, Phryne, you're terrible," she gasped between giggles. But as I basked in the attention, I noticed Nolan's face had gone completely still. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and he stared down at his plate like he was studying the pattern on the china. "I mean, seriously," I continued, riding the wave of laughter. "He spent 2 hours last Christmas measuring spaces between tiny bells." "2 hours?" I said. "Nolan, they're decorations, not a mathematical equation." But he just kept measuring with that little ruler of his. More laughter rippled around the table, though I caught Irene glancing uncomfortably between Nolan and me. Bryce cleared his throat and reached for his water glass. "Well," Bryce said, obviously trying to change the subject, "how about we order dessert? I heard they have that tiramisu you like, Nolan." But Nolan was already pushing back his chair. "Actually, I think I'm done for tonight," he said quietly, his voice carefully controlled. "Thanks for dinner, everyone. I'm going to head home." "Oh, come on," I said, still giggling. "Don't be so sensitive. Everyone knows I'm just joking around." He looked at me then, really looked at me, and something in his eyes made my stomach flutter with an emotion I couldn't quite name. Not fear exactly, but something close to it. "I know exactly what you're doing, Phryne," he said, his voice so low only I could hear it. "And so does everyone else." After he left, the mood at the table shifted slightly, but Sylvia quickly steered the conversation back to lighter topics. I found myself reaching for my phone, scrolling through my contacts, until I found Jasper's number. "Had to embarrass the husband at his own birthday dinner," I texted. "Sometimes I wonder why I even bother trying to make things fun around here." His response came quickly. "Sounds like you need better company, someone who appreciates your sense of humor." I smiled, slipping my phone back into my purse. At least someone understood me. But as I drove home later that night, I couldn't shake the image of Nolan's face when he'd looked at me across that table. There had been something different in his expression, something I'd never seen before. It wasn't hurt or embarrassment. It was resolve. 3 weeks after the birthday dinner, I found myself staying late at the medical office more and more often. It wasn't because of the workload. Medical billing had its busy periods, but nothing I couldn't handle during regular hours. The truth was, I dreaded going home to the suffocating silence that had settled over our house like a heavy blanket. Nolan barely spoke to me anymore. He'd come home from his accounting firm, help Daisy with her homework, make dinner, and then disappear into his home office with stacks of papers. When I tried to make conversation, he'd respond with polite, clipped answers that made it clear he wasn't interested in talking. "How was your day?" I'd ask. "Fine. Did you see that funny video I sent you?" "No." "The Hendersons invited us to their barbecue next weekend. You can go if you want." It was maddening. I felt like I was living with a stranger who happened to share my last name and sleep in the same house. So when Jasper started texting me more frequently, it felt like a lifeline to sanity. Jasper Connolly worked as an IT technician for Morrison & Associates, a rival accounting firm across town. We'd met at a professional networking event 6 months earlier, and he'd been flirting with me ever since. At first I'd brushed off his attention. I was married after all. But as things with Nolan grew colder, Jasper's messages became increasingly appealing. "Working late again," he texted one Thursday evening as I sat at my desk, pretending to review insurance claims. "Unfortunately, my husband's in one of his moods again. Sometimes I feel like I'm invisible in my own house." His loss. A woman like you deserves to be appreciated. I found myself smiling at my phone, feeling a warm flutter in my chest that I hadn't experienced in months. When was the last time Nolan had complimented me? When was the last time he'd even really looked at me? "You're sweet. I wish more men thought like you do." "Want to grab coffee sometime, just as friends? Sounds like you could use someone to talk to." I stared at the message for a long time before responding. Coffee was harmless, right? Just two adults having a conversation. It wasn't like I was planning to run away with him. "That sounds nice. Tomorrow after work?" The next evening, I told Nolan I had to work late to finish a difficult insurance audit. He didn't even look up from his laptop when I made the excuse. "Okay," he said. "I'll pick up Daisy from soccer practice and make dinner." "Thanks," I said, waiting for him to ask when I'd be home or if I needed him to save me a plate. But he just kept typing, his fingers clicking steadily across the keyboard. I met Jasper at a small cafe downtown, far enough from our neighborhood that I wouldn't run into anyone I knew. He was already waiting when I arrived, his dark hair slightly tousled, and his smile warm and inviting. "You look beautiful," he said, standing to pull out my chair. "That color really brings out your eyes." I felt myself blushing like a teenager. When was the last time Nolan had noticed what I was wearing? "Thank you. You clean up pretty well yourself." We talked for 2 hours. Jasper listened, really listened, when I told him about feeling unappreciated at home, about how Nolan treated me more like a roommate than a wife. He asked questions, made sympathetic comments, and never once made me feel like I was being dramatic or oversensitive. "Marriage is supposed to be a partnership," he said, reaching across the table to touch my hand briefly. "You shouldn't have to beg for attention from your own husband." "I know," I sighed. "I just don't know what happened to us. We used to laugh together, used to talk about everything. Now it's like we're strangers." "Maybe he's just taking you for granted," Jasper suggested. "Some guys don't realize what they have until it's too late." After that, the coffee dates became a regular thing. Then Jasper started suggesting dinner at quiet restaurants outside of town. I told myself it was just friendship. I needed someone to talk to, someone who understood me. It wasn't my fault that Nolan had become so distant and cold. The first time I went to Jasper's apartment, I told myself I was just stopping by to pick up a book he'd mentioned. But when he offered me wine and put on soft music, I didn't leave. When he kissed me, I kissed him back. "I've wanted to do that for months," he whispered against my lips. "We shouldn't," I said, but I didn't pull away. "Why not? You're not happy. Life's too short to waste it on someone who doesn't appreciate you." I came home that night at almost midnight, my lips still tingling and my heart racing with a mixture of guilt and excitement I hadn't felt in years. Nolan was asleep, or pretending to be. He didn't ask where I'd been. Over the next few weeks, I found myself making more and more excuses to stay out late. Jasper and I texted constantly, flirty messages that made me feel desired and alive again. I started taking more care with my appearance, buying new clothes, and getting my hair done. "Mommy, you look pretty," Daisy said one morning, as I applied lipstick in the hallway mirror. "Thank you, sweetheart." "Are you and Daddy fighting?" she asked, her 6-year-old face scrunched with worry. "No, honey. Why would you ask that? You don't talk to each other anymore. And Daddy looks sad." I knelt down to her level, smoothing her blonde hair. "Daddy and I are just busy with work right now. Everything's fine." But everything wasn't fine, and deep down, I knew it. I was lying to my daughter, lying to my husband, and lying to myself. But it was easier than facing the truth, that I was having an emotional affair with a man who made me feel special, while my marriage crumbled around me. The night everything changed started like any other. I was getting ready to leave for another late work session when I realized I'd left my phone on the kitchen counter. I rushed back to grab it, not wanting to keep Jasper waiting, but as I picked up my phone, I noticed Nolan standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "Forget something?" he asked quietly. "Just my phone," I said, trying to sound casual. "I'll see you later." I didn't realize until I was already in my car that I'd left my phone unlocked, Jasper's latest message still visible on the screen. "Can't wait to see you tonight, beautiful. I've been thinking about you all day." And I definitely didn't notice Nolan picking up my phone after I left, his jaw set in that same expression of quiet resolve I'd seen at his birthday dinner. 2 weeks later, we hosted our annual family barbecue. It was a tradition that had started when Daisy was born, a casual get-together in our backyard with Nolan's parents, his brother's family, and my mother. Usually, I enjoyed these gatherings. They gave me a chance to play the perfect hostess, to show off our home and our seemingly happy family. But this year felt different. The tension between Nolan and me had become so thick you could cut it with a knife, and I found myself overcompensating, trying too hard to appear cheerful and carefree. "More potato salad, anyone?" I called out, carrying a fresh bowl from the kitchen to the patio table where everyone sat eating. Irene looked up from helping Daisy cut her hamburger. "Thank you, dear. This is delicious. Did you try a new recipe?" "Just added some extra herbs," I said, settling into my chair next to Nolan. He didn't acknowledge my presence, just continued methodically eating his burger while staring across the yard. Bryce's 11-year-old daughter, Lila, was chattering excitedly about her upcoming school play. I get to be the narrator, which means I have the most lines to memorize. Mum says I need to practice every day so I don't forget them on stage. "That's wonderful, sweetie," I said. "I'm sure you'll do great." "Uncle Nolan, are you going to come watch my play?" Lila asked. Nolan finally looked up, his face softening as he focused on his niece. "Of course I will. I wouldn't miss it." "What about you, Aunt Phryne?" "I'll try," I said. "It depends on my work schedule." I caught Irene and Bryce exchanging a look across the table. Lately, it seemed like everyone was watching Nolan and me, waiting for something to happen. The constant scrutiny was exhausting. As the afternoon wore on and the wine flowed, I found myself growing more animated, more determined to prove that everything was perfectly fine in the Marchbanks household. When Bryce started telling a story about Nolan's college days, I saw my opportunity. "Oh, that reminds me of something hilarious," I said, laughing before I'd even started the story. "You all know how particular Nolan is about organization, right? Well, last week I was looking for my car keys, and I found them in his sock drawer. Apparently, I'd left them on the dresser, and he'd organized them away." A few polite chuckles rippled around the table, but I was just getting started. "And you should see him during tax season," I continued, my voice getting louder and more theatrical. "He turns into this complete control freak, Last year, he color-coded our receipts by month and category. Color-coded. I told him, "Honey, the IRS doesn't care if our grocery receipts are blue and our gas receipts are green." Nolan's jaw tightened, but he didn't say anything. His silence only fueled my performance. "But the best part," I said, standing up and gesturing with my wine glass, "is how he handles any kind of disagreement. Remember at Christmas when we couldn't agree on where to put the tree? He got out his measuring tape and started calculating optimal placement based on electrical outlet proximity and foot traffic patterns." Sylvia was giggling now, encouraging me with her laughter. "Oh, Phryne, you're terrible." "I finally told him," I said, my voice carrying across the backyard. I said, "Nolan, your little bells don't even ring loud enough to argue with me properly. If you're going to disagree with me, at least do it with some conviction." The words hung in the air for a moment before Sylvia burst into loud laughter, slapping the table. "Little bells? Oh, that's perfect." But as I looked around the table, basking in what I thought was appreciation for my wit, I noticed the uncomfortable expressions on everyone else's faces. Irene looked mortified. Her cheeks flushed red. Bryce was staring down at his plate, clearly embarrassed. Even Lila seemed confused by the tension that had suddenly filled the air. And Nolan was looking at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Not hurt, not angry, but something much more dangerous. He looked like a man who had finally made a decision. "Excuse me," he said quietly, standing up from the table. "I need to check on something inside." He walked away without another word, leaving me standing there with my wine glass, suddenly feeling very exposed and foolish. "Well," Bryce said after a long, awkward pause, "who wants dessert? I think there's ice cream in the freezer." The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of forced cheerfulness and stilted conversation. People left earlier than usual, making polite excuses about early mornings and other commitments. As I cleaned up the backyard, I tried to convince myself that everything was fine, that I'd just had a little too much wine and gotten carried away. But 3 days later, Lila repeated my little bells joke to her friends at school during lunch. One of those friends happened to be the daughter of a woman who worked at Nolan's accounting firm. By the end of the week, half the office had heard about how Nolan Marchbanks's wife publicly mocked his masculinity at a family gathering. I didn't find out about this until my coworker Janet pulled me aside at the medical office. "Phryne, honey," she said, her voice full of false sympathy. "I heard about what happened at your barbecue. Are you and Nolan having problems?" My stomach dropped. "What do you mean?" "Well, Linda Morrison's daughter goes to school with your niece, and apparently there's been some talk about some things you said about Nolan in front of your family." I felt my face burning with embarrassment and anger. It was just a joke. People are making way too big a deal out of nothing. But even as I said it, I knew the damage was done. In a town like ours, gossip spread faster than wildfire, and there was nothing more delicious than a story about a wife publicly humiliating her husband. That night, I tried to talk to Nolan about it, to explain that I hadn't meant anything by what I'd said. But when I knocked on his office door, I found him sitting at his computer, methodically copying files from my phone to his laptop. My phone. The phone I'd thought I'd lost 2 days earlier, only to find it mysteriously returned to my purse. "What are you doing?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. He looked up at me with those same resolved eyes, and I realized that my husband, my quiet, predictable, organized husband, had been planning something all along. "What I should have done months ago," he said simply, and turned back to his computer. As I watched him work, copying message after message, photo after photo, I finally understood that the joke hadn't just backfired, it had started a war. The gossip mill in our small town worked with ruthless efficiency. Within a week of Lila's innocent retelling of my barbecue joke, it seemed like everyone knew about my public humiliation of Nolan. But worse than that, people were starting to piece together other details about my recent behavior. At work, Conversations would stop when I entered a room. My colleagues would exchange meaningful glances and speak in hushed tones that made my skin crawl. Janet, who had initially approached me with what seemed like genuine concern, was now clearly enjoying the drama. "I ran into Carol Stevens at the grocery store yesterday," she said during our lunch break, her voice dripping with false innocence. "She mentioned seeing you at that little cafe downtown with some man. Not Nolan, obviously. She said you two looked very friendly." My fork clattered against my salad bowl. "Carol Stevens needs to mind her own business." "Oh, I'm sure it was perfectly innocent," Janet continued, her eyes gleaming with malicious curiosity. "But you know how people talk, especially after what happened at your barbecue." I wanted to scream at her, to tell her that my personal life was none of her concern. But I also knew that any reaction I gave would only fuel more gossip, so I forced myself to smile and change the subject. "How's your daughter's wedding planning coming along?" But the damage was spreading beyond my workplace. Daisy came home from school that Tuesday with tears in her eyes and grass stains on her uniform. "What happened, sweetheart?" I asked, kneeling down to examine a scrape on her knee. "Tommy Henderson said you were mean to Daddy," she sniffled. "He said his mum told him that you said bad things about Daddy in front of everyone. I told him that wasn't true, but then he pushed me down at recess." My heart clenched with guilt and rage. "Oh, honey, I'm so sorry. Tommy's mum doesn't know what she's talking about." "But did you say mean things about Daddy?" she asked, her 6-year-old eyes wide and trusting. How do you explain to a child that sometimes adults make mistakes? That sometimes mummies say things they shouldn't say when they're feeling frustrated and unappreciated? "Daddy and I had a little disagreement," I said carefully. "Sometimes grown-ups say things they don't really mean when they're upset, but that doesn't mean I don't love Daddy, okay?" She nodded, but I could see the confusion and worry in her expression. That night, I heard her crying in her room after bedtime. When I went to check on her, she was curled up in bed with her favorite stuffed animal. "I don't want you and Daddy to get divorced like Emma's parents did," she whispered. "We're not getting divorced," I said, stroking her hair. "Everything's going to be fine." But even as I said the words, I wasn't sure I believed them. Nolan had become even more distant since the barbecue incident. He spoke to me only when necessary, and even then, his responses were cold and formal. He'd started sleeping in the guest room, claiming he had early meetings and didn't want to wake me up. The worst part was how he'd changed around other people. Gone was the quiet, accommodating man who used to defer to me in social situations. Now, when we encountered neighbors or acquaintances, Nolan was polite but distant with me, while being warm and engaging with everyone else. At the grocery store, Mrs. Patterson from down the street stopped to chat with us. While she was talking, Nolan made pleasant conversation and even laughed at her jokes. But when she asked about our weekend plans, he said, "I'm taking Daisy to the Children's Museum on Saturday. I'm not sure what Phryne has planned." The message was clear. We were no longer a unit. We were two separate people who happened to live in the same house. Things got worse when Irene called to tell me she'd be picking up Daisy for their regular Saturday afternoon outing. "Actually," she said, her voice cooler than usual, "I think it might be better if Daisy spends the whole weekend with us. Give you and Nolan some time to work things out." "That's not necessary," I said. "Everything's fine." "Is it?" Irene asked pointedly. "Because from where I'm sitting, it doesn't look fine at all. That poor child is caught in the middle of whatever's going on between you two. And frankly, Phryne, I'm disappointed in how you've been handling things." "How I've been handling things?" I repeated, my voice rising. "What's that supposed to mean?" "I think you know exactly what it means. Nolan is a good man and a wonderful father. He deserves better than to be publicly humiliated by his own wife." The accusation hit me like a slap. "I made one joke, Irene. One joke at a family gathering. Everyone's acting like I committed some kind of crime." "It wasn't just one joke, though, was it?" she said quietly. "It's been building for months. The way you talked to him, The way you dismiss him, the way you've been distracted lately. My blood ran cold. How much did she know? How much did any of them know? I don't know what you're implying, but I'm not implying anything, Irene interrupted. I'm stating facts. My son is miserable, my granddaughter is confused and upset, and you seem more concerned with defending yourself than fixing your marriage. After she hung up, I sat in my kitchen feeling like the walls were closing in around me. Everyone was against me. Everyone was taking Nolan's side without even trying to understand my perspective. I called Sylvia, desperate for someone who would listen to me, someone who would validate my feelings. "Oh, honey," she sighed when I told her about my conversation with Irene. "That woman has always been too protective of her precious son. She's never thought anyone was good enough for him." "But what if she's right?" I asked, surprising myself with the admission. "What if I have been too hard on him?" "Nonsense," Sylvia said firmly. "Marriage is about give and take. If Nolan can't handle a little teasing, that's his problem, not yours. Men these days are too sensitive. Your father could take a joke." Her words should have made me feel better, but they didn't. Instead, they made me think about all the ways Nolan wasn't like my father, all the ways that had initially attracted me to him. That evening, as I was sorting through the mail, I found an envelope addressed to me in formal, legal-looking script. My hands shook as I opened it, though I already suspected what it contained. Inside was a letter from Patterson, Wells and Associates, a law firm downtown. The letter was brief and to the point. Mr. Nolan Marchbanks had retained their services for a domestic matter and requested that all future communication regarding this matter be directed through their office. I read the letter 3 times before the full implications hit me. Nolan hadn't just been copying files from my phone as some kind of empty threat. He was building a case. My husband, my quiet, predictable, organized husband, was preparing for war, and I was just beginning to realize how badly outgunned I was. The law office of Patterson, Wells and Associates occupied a stately brick building in the historic district downtown. As I sat in the waiting room 3 days after receiving their letter, I tried to project confidence I didn't feel. My own attorney, David Kruger, had squeezed me in for an emergency consultation, but his initial assessment hadn't been encouraging. "The fact that he's retained counsel suggests he's serious about this," David had told me over the phone. "We need to assume he's been documenting everything and prepare accordingly." Now, sitting across from David in his mahogany-paneled office, I watched him flip through a manila folder that seemed impossibly thick for a marriage that was supposedly just having communication problems. "Phryne," he said, looking up from the documents, "I need you to be completely honest with me. Is there anything in your recent behavior that could be construed as infidelity?" My mouth went dry. "What do you mean?" "I mean exactly what I said. Have you been involved with another man, either physically or emotionally?" I thought about Jasper, about our coffee dates and dinners, and that night in his apartment, about the hundreds of text messages we'd exchanged, the flirtations, the complaints about my marriage. There's someone I've been talking to," I admitted, "but it's not what you think. We're just friends." David's expression didn't change, but I saw him make a note on his legal pad. Define talking to. "We text sometimes. We've had coffee a few times. It's completely innocent." "Have you been to his apartment?" The question hung in the air like a loaded gun. "Once or twice, but nothing happened." "Phryne," David said gently, "I need you to understand that in today's digital age, nothing happened is almost impossible to prove if there's evidence suggesting otherwise. Text messages, location data, witness statements, they all paint a picture that a judge will interpret based on the most likely scenario." "But I haven't done anything wrong," I protested. "I was lonely and frustrated, and I needed someone to talk to. My husband had completely shut me out." "I understand that, and those feelings are valid. But legally speaking, what matters is how your actions can be interpreted. Now, tell me about these public incidents I've been hearing about." I explained the birthday dinner and the barbecue, trying to frame them as harmless jokes that had been blown out of proportion. But even as I spoke, I could hear how weak my explanation sounded. "The problem," David said when I finished, "is that these incidents establish a pattern of public humiliation. Combined with evidence of an extramarital relationship, it creates a narrative that will be very difficult to counter." What kind of evidence could he possibly have? David consulted his notes again. Well, based on what opposing counsel has indicated, we should expect phone records, text message transcripts, location data from your devices, possibly photographs or video from these public incidents, and witness statements from family members and acquaintances. My heart sank as I realized the scope of what Nolan had been doing. While I'd been focused on my own feelings and frustrations, he'd been methodically building a case against me. "What about Daisy?" I asked. "Surely no judge would take a child away from her mother over some text messages and a few jokes." "In custody cases, judges look at what's in the best interest of the child," David explained. "If your husband can demonstrate that your behavior has been affecting Daisy's well-being, and it sounds like there's evidence of that with the school incidents, it could definitely impact custody arrangements." I left David's office feeling like I was drowning. Everything I'd thought was private, everything I'd convinced myself was harmless, was about to be laid bare in a courtroom for strangers to judge. That evening, I tried one last time to talk to Nolan. I found him in his office, working at his computer as usual. The room was meticulously organized, with file folders labeled and stacked in neat piles. "Nolan," I said, hovering in the doorway, "we need to talk." He looked up, his expression neutral. "About what?" "About this lawyer situation, about us. We can work this out without involving attorneys and courts. Think about Daisy." "I am thinking about Daisy," he said quietly. "That's exactly why I'm doing this." "What's that supposed to mean?" He turned in his chair to face me fully. "It means that our daughter shouldn't have to hear her friends at school repeating jokes about her father's masculinity. It means she shouldn't have to wonder why her mother is never home for dinner anymore. It means she deserves better than parents who can't treat each other with basic respect." "I made a mistake," I said, stepping into the room. "I know that now, but we can fix this. We can go to counseling. We can—" "Phryne," he interrupted, "you didn't make a mistake. You made choices, lots of them, over many months." He opened one of the file folders on his desk and pulled out a stack of printed pages. Even from across the room, I could see they were screenshots of text messages. "You chose to mock me publicly, not once but repeatedly," he continued. "You chose to seek emotional intimacy with another man instead of addressing problems in our marriage. You chose to lie to me, to Daisy, to everyone about where you were spending your evenings." He held up the printed messages. "You chose to share intimate details about our marriage with a man you barely know. You chose to meet him at his apartment and then lie about it." Each word hit me like a physical blow. Seeing my private conversations printed out in black and white made them seem sordid and shameful in a way I'd never acknowledged before. "I was unhappy," I whispered. "I felt invisible in my own marriage." "Then you should have talked to me," he said. "You should have suggested counseling, or told me how you were feeling, or done any of a dozen things that might have helped us fix our problems. Instead, you chose to humiliate me and seek comfort elsewhere." "It wasn't like that." "It was exactly like that." He stood up, and for the first time in our entire marriage, I felt intimidated by my husband. Not because he was threatening or aggressive, but because he was absolutely, unshakably certain of his position. "I've spent months trying to understand what I did wrong," he said. "I've questioned every interaction we've had, every decision I've made, wondering how I failed you so badly that you felt justified in treating me the way you have. Nolan, but then I realized something," he continued. "I didn't fail you. You failed us. You failed our marriage. You failed our daughter. And you failed yourself. And now you want me to pretend none of it happened so we can go back to the way things were." He walked past me toward the door, then stopped and turned back. The way things wasn't working, Phryne, at least not for me. And it definitely wasn't working for Daisy. So no, we're not going to counselling, we're not going to work it out. We're going to court, and we're going to let a judge decide what's best for our daughter. After he left the room, I sank into his desk chair, surrounded by the evidence of my own choices. File folders full of printed messages, bank statements highlighting unexplained expenses, a timeline of my lies and deceptions laid out with the methodical precision that was so characteristically Nolan. For the first time since this whole nightmare began, I understood that I wasn't just losing an argument or facing an embarrassing social situation. I was losing my family. And unlike my jokes and my affairs and my justifications, this was one thing I couldn't take back. The courthouse smelled like old wood and industrial disinfectant. As I sat at the defendant's table next to David Kruger, I tried to project confidence I absolutely didn't feel. Across the aisle, Nolan sat with his attorney, Margaret Patterson, looking calm and composed in his best navy suit. The past 3 months had been a nightmare of depositions, document requests, and character assassinations disguised as legal proceedings. Every embarrassing detail of my relationship with Jasper had been dissected and analyzed. Every public slight I'd made against Nolan had been documented and presented as evidence of my character. Judge Elizabeth Morrison, a stern woman in her 60s with silver hair and sharp eyes, reviewed the case file one final time before looking up at both legal teams. "This is a dissolution of marriage case with contested custody," she announced. "I've reviewed all submitted evidence, witness statements, and expert testimony. Are both parties ready to proceed with final arguments?" Margaret Patterson stood first. She was everything I wasn't: professional, polished, and devastatingly prepared. "Your Honor," she began, "this case represents a clear pattern of destructive behavior that has directly impacted the welfare of a minor child. Mrs. Marchbanks engaged in a months-long emotional affair while simultaneously conducting a campaign of public humiliation against her husband." She gestured to a presentation board covered with printed text messages. "The evidence shows that Mrs. Marchbanks shared intimate details of her marriage with her affair partner, including complaints about her husband's character and masculinity. She repeatedly mocked Mr. Marchbanks in public settings, including at family gatherings where their 6-year-old daughter was present." I watched the judge's face as Margaret continued, looking for any sign of sympathy or understanding. There was none. "The impact on the child has been documented through school reports and counselor statements. Daisy Marchbanks has exhibited signs of emotional distress, including behavioral problems at school and anxiety about her parents' relationship. This distress can be directly traced to Mrs. Marchbanks's choices to prioritize her extramarital relationship over her family's well-being." Margaret pulled out another document. "Mr. Marchbanks, in contrast, has maintained his focus on his daughter's needs throughout this difficult period. He has attended every school event, maintained consistent routines, and shielded his daughter from the details of his wife's infidelity as much as possible." When it was David's turn, he did his best to present my side of the story. He talked about the breakdown in communication in our marriage, about my feelings of neglect and isolation, about how the affair was emotional rather than physical. "Mrs. Marchbanks acknowledges that she made poor choices during a difficult time in her marriage," he said. "But these choices don't negate her fundamental love for her daughter or her ability to be a good mother. The incidents cited by opposing counsel have been taken out of context and blown out of proportion." But even as David spoke, I could see that his argument sounded weak against the mountain of evidence Nolan had compiled. Phone records showing hundreds of text messages to Jasper. Location data proving I'd lied about working late. Screenshots of messages where I'd complained about Nolan and shared private details of our marriage. The most damaging evidence came from an unexpected source. Lila, Nolan's 11-year-old niece, who had written a letter to the court describing what she'd witnessed at our family barbecue. Aunt Phryne was being really mean to Uncle Nolan, Margaret read from Lila's letter. She was making fun of him in front of everyone, and he looked really sad. I didn't understand all the jokes, but they made me feel uncomfortable. Later, I told my friends at school because I thought it was funny, but now I feel bad because I think I hurt Uncle Nolan's feelings even more. The judge called a brief recess, and I found myself in the courthouse bathroom, staring at my reflection in the harsh fluorescent lighting. The woman looking back at me seemed like a stranger, hollow-eyed, defensive, and utterly defeated. When court resumed, Judge Morrison delivered her ruling with clinical precision. After careful consideration of all evidence and testimony, this court finds that while both parents love their child, there are significant concerns about Mrs. Marchbanks's judgment and decision-making during the relevant time period. My heart sank as she continued. The evidence clearly establishes that Mrs. Marchbanks engaged in an extramarital emotional affair while simultaneously conducting a pattern of public humiliation against her husband. These actions directly impacted the minor child's emotional well-being and social environment. The judge looked directly at me. Mrs. Marchbanks, your choices to mock your husband publicly, particularly in front of family members, and by extension your daughter's peer group, demonstrate a concerning lack of judgment regarding the impact of your actions on your child. However, she continued, this court also recognizes that children benefit from maintaining relationships with both parents when possible. Therefore, the court awards joint legal custody with primary physical custody to Mr. Marchbanks. The words hit me like a physical blow. Primary custody to Nolan meant Daisy would live with him most of the time. I would become the weekend parent, the one who got scheduled visits instead of daily bedtime stories. Mrs. Marchbanks will have supervised visitation for the first 6 months, after which the court will review the arrangement based on demonstrated behavioral changes and completion of court-mandated counseling. Supervised visitation, I wouldn't even be allowed to be alone with my own daughter. Additionally, Judge Morrison continued, this court is implementing a communication restriction. Mrs. Marchbanks is prohibited from making any public statements, social media posts, or other communications that disparage Mr. Marchbanks or discuss the details of their marriage or divorce proceedings. The gag order was the final humiliation. Not only was I losing my daughter, but I was being legally prevented from defending myself or sharing my side of the story. As the judge concluded the proceedings, and we stood for her exit, I felt the full weight of what I'd lost crashing down on me. Across the aisle, Nolan was quietly shaking hands with his attorney, his face showing relief rather than triumph. Outside the courthouse, I watched as Nolan walked to his car where Daisy was waiting with Irene. My daughter ran to him, wrapping her arms around his waist as he knelt down to her level. They had a brief conversation I couldn't hear, and then she looked over at me with confusion and sadness in her 6-year-old eyes. I wanted to run to her, to explain that Mommy had made some mistakes, but that I still loved her more than anything in the world. But the court order was clear. Any contact had to be supervised and scheduled through the proper channels. As I stood on the courthouse steps watching my husband and daughter drive away together, I finally understood the true cost of my harmless jokes and my innocent friendship with Jasper. I had traded my family for the temporary validation of a man who had disappeared from my life the moment things got complicated. The little bells I had mocked so cruelly weren't too small to argue with me after all. They had been quietly tolling the end of my marriage, and I had been too arrogant and self-absorbed to hear them until it was too late. Nolan had gotten his revenge, but it wasn't the petty, emotional retaliation I might have expected. It was something far more devastating, the methodical, legal dismantling of the life I had taken for granted, executed with the same quiet precision he brought to everything else. As I walked alone to my car, I realized that the woman who had stood in that restaurant 9 months ago, confidently mocking her husband's little bells, no longer existed. In her place was someone who finally understood that actions have consequences, that words can wound more deeply than any physical blow, and that some jokes aren't funny at all. They're just cruel. And cruelty, I had learned, always comes back to haunt you in the end.